want to welcome everyone to today's session, online workshop series, COLE Assessment Online Workshop Series, Making Digital Assessment Count, Building Competencies and Skills that are Transferable to the Workforce. Today's first session, and I'll refer back to that, we have 3 sessions. Today's first session is Let the Horse Pull the Cart, Learner-Centered Design as the Driver for Digital Assessment. Panelists today are Professor Mpine Makoe and Professor George Veletsianos, who I'll speak to introduce more formally in a moment. My name is Kirk Perris, I'm the chair, and today's February 4th. We have people coming from around the world, from the west coast of Canada and Vancouver and area, into Europe and South Asia, Africa, and even we have some participants from the Pacific. So we're really happy to see so many people join. And we hope that you'll find today's session stimulating and fruitful to your own work. So as I said, today is the first of 3 online workshops that is being run by COLE, the Commonwealth of Learning. My organization is an intergovernmental organization that utilizes technology-enabled learning to respond and support our member states, the 54 member states of the Commonwealth, primarily middle and low-income countries. And you can certainly look more at our website, cole.org. The first of 3 online workshops today, as of course we're all here. The next is going to be February 18th, and then the third will be on March 4th. And I'll speak to those again at the end of today's workshop. The session today is being recorded, and we'll make it available on COLE's YouTube channel. Again, more information will be coming at the end of today's session. I will be circulating with my colleague, Ms. Kixin Feng. You can see Kixin there as one of the panelists. We'll be circulating a survey post-webinar. And again, we'll come back to that. So today, organization of the workshop. Well, first I want to introduce Professors George Veletsianos and Professor Mpine Makoe. George is a professor at the School of Education and Technology at Royal Roads University. And as you can see in his bio, he holds a Canada Research Chair in Innovative Learning, and also is a Commonwealth of Learning Chair. So I work with George on research in mutual sort of interest areas. Likewise, Professor Mpine Makoe is a professor at UNISA, University of South Africa, and is the lead in the Institute for Open and Distance Learning. Mpine also holds several positions, Director of the African Council for Distance Education, and also as a Commonwealth of Learning Chair. And I also work with Mpine, and she'll speak to some of the work that we're doing. Today's workshop, the organization, I'm going to speak to a few of these points in a moment, and they'll come in sequence. I think the main idea is that we're going to have 4 mini presentations. We'll go in sequence with Mpine providing a bit of a context, followed by George, similar, but of course a different kind of approach. And then they'll both speak to either some examples or case studies that they've experienced with online assessment or digital assessment. And of course, we'll have a discussion there. We encourage people to post questions in the Q&A. We have a very active engagement on the chat right now as well. Behind the scenes, I'll be working with Kixin to collate Q&A questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can, but perhaps collapse them or collate them into one general question in a given topic that we can address to our panelists. Badging. This is just a simple image. Badging, which you may or may not know of, in the Canada or North American context, you earn a badge in organizations like Girl Guides or Boy Scouts, when you can actually demonstrate knowledge or skill about something. Badging has been transferred to the online context. It's been around for some time. You can certainly read more about it if you put it into Google and search. But I bring this up because we are discussing the offering of badges to participants, people like yourselves who are joining today's online workshop. So this is just an image of the kinds of badges that we'll be offering. We're not just offering badges for you to participate or to sign into today's workshop. We want you to do something. And just like a physical badge that you might sew or iron onto the sleeve of your shirt or jacket, we want you to demonstrate a knowledge or skill. And here's what we're proposing for you to earn a badge: to pick a workshop, one of the 3. Again, today is the first. and to write a reflective piece on how the ideas you heard guided your thinking and propose how you might work with peers to enable some of the digital assessment strategies discussed. We'll follow up on email, but we hope that you'll take advantage of this and of course encourage you to attend the subsequent online workshops. Igniter, my colleagues, Professor Veletsianos and Professor Makoe, will be given an Igniter badge because their job today is to ignite or to ignite your thinking around digital assessment. I'm just shifting now to a quick summary of the polls. All of you who registered for today were asked to respond to a few questions as part of the registration. And just a quick summary, we have, if you look at the first slide, we have a proportion of almost, well, really about almost on the nose, 2/3 indicated they have a fair level of understanding on digital assessment. Some are high and some are low, and that's great. We want a real mix, and we certainly encourage people to connect in the chat, post questions on the Q&A to share their experiences. What is your organization? We have predominantly just over half that are coming from the post-secondary sector, followed by government, secondary schools, primary, or TVET and primary school. Those others, you almost make up a quarter of the people that registered for today's online workshop. We'd encourage you to identify yourselves. We're curious to know where you come from, what sectors, whether it's the private sector, some other sector. Please share that information as you collaborate on the chat. What is your job role? Most are on the front lines as educators, teachers, faculty. Again, those other, very similar from the previous or the second middle slide. Please identify what your job role is. I'd be curious to know what other stakeholders and interested participants are coming to today's online workshop. So I just want to, before I hand off the baton to Professor Mpine, just want to give an overview of what we're talking about today, set the context, what we're trying to achieve. Of course, framing assessment, more so, not so much evaluation, but they certainly go hand in hand. Assessment is the impetus to evaluate. Evaluation, of course, is the measure of what someone has learned based on metrics, rubrics, etc. Meaningful online assessment that enables learners to demonstrate knowledge, competencies, and skills. And ultimately, the big picture is really how to better prepare learners. Employability, promotion, entrepreneurship. These are the pressing issues that we find in our work that learners in post-secondary education are seeking, but I think it also certainly trickles down to all levels of education. Just a quick sort of digression. I think that also the big premise, and it speaks to the metaphor of today's presentation, and that is the cart, putting the cart before the horse, is this notion that assessment has historically been misaligned or malaligned to the real objectives of learning. Oftentimes we do assessments because we need to. They're add-ons at the end of a series of modules, lectures, content, or whatever the case. I think we want to try and invert that assessment should be, and a learner-centered assessment should be the driver to developing assessment types of tasks. And our panelists will certainly expand on that today. Of course, we want to speak to what we've tried during or after COVID. That was certainly a central question that came up during your registration. A lot of people offered some open-ended questions or comments on that. Some ways forward, we'll touch on these ideas: learner-centered design, the big picture is constructive alignment, and you can search into that if you're not familiar with that term. Of course, we're talking about integrity of assessment and reliability of assessment. Those last two are very much the focus of the subsequent online workshops. So I'll take a pause. I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to introduce my colleague, Professor Mpine Makoe. Mpine, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kirk, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good anything, because we are all over the world. And thank you so much for coming up in numbers to hear us talk about assessment. And I know we are very worried about assessment, especially in this era of COVID, where all of a sudden we're thrown into the deep end of teaching in an online space. We don't even know how to do it. We don't even understand the skills that goes with it. And then all of a sudden, while we are teaching, we know that we have to assess. And this problem was not only for contact universities, but also for other universities as well. even open universities or distance education universities like ours, we used to have exams in big rooms and people will come in and sit, and then there'll be invigilators. So invigilating was one of the thing about exams. So that's why today we want to talk about we want for you to look at the horse and the cart and how they work together. Now, what we usually do, and this is a funny picture, it's not a picture that you would see happening elsewhere. Otherwise, there'll be no driver here. What it says is that the driver of what we need to do should be a learner-centered design. It is a design thing. With online learning, we start with instructional design. It has to be right from that beginning. And instructional design, according to online learning, it starts with learning outcomes. You start by saying, what is it that I want this learner to achieve at the end of the course? And then you come up with other objectives. For this learner to achieve this is what they are supposed to be doing. And then you move on to the competencies, the skills, the knowledge that the learner needs to have. So you need to assess people in line with that. Content comes after. Content, it comes after when you have decided that this is the learning outcomes. And you'll see when you start there, you'll realize that you tend to go for the content that is most relevant, the content that can be assessed for the benefit of the learning outcome. So as we move along, you will see that these two should not be separated. These two actually should be the other way around. The horse should be the one that is a driver, which is the learner-centered approach, which is the design. When we design for students, with students in mind, we start with what the student needs to know at the end of the course. We don't start with what I know, because that's the culture and the tradition in our spaces, in the way we teach. We teach the content. And in this era where content is everywhere, where you can get it from YouTube or in the internet, whether it's right or wrong, it's content. And because content is everywhere, students also know that they can go and get content somewhere. And if they don't understand this concept that you're trying to teach them or lecture them, they will go somewhere else and get something that has been done properly. So what is important is that we put the driver at the right space so that we look at assessment in a way that is supposed to happening. So the horse has to pull the cart, not the other way around. So this imagery is just showing us how to move forward with assessment. Next. Okay, and as we are moving forward, we need to understand where assessment is. Assessment is designed, is one of those more powerful teaching tools, and this was said by Ramsden in 1982, that is one of the most powerful teaching tools for directing student learning. And in an ODL environment, or even in an online environment, we teach through assessment, because we don't have students we don't see the teacher as students are not giving us cues on whether we should continue or whether we should stop, whether we are going too fast. What we rely on is assessment. And you'll see later that the assessment, there are different types of assessment. Hence, we cannot have just one assignment in 3 months or whatever. Then we'll never know what students are doing. We'll never know what needs to be done. So it is important, therefore, that we gauge assessment like that. So assessment, it's a progressive activities. And this is what maybe in contact or traditional universities tend to see it as informal assessment. This is in online learning. This is part of the assessment. You have to have activities, especially when students are away from the lecturer. You need activities that will pace their work. that will enable you to see if they're actually doing their work. Because if you don't have a series of activities, be it little MCQs, self-assessment, and online, the beauty about online, it allows for that self-assessment where you can gauge if they have actually gone through the study material. And then there will be certain activities that they do to add to their knowledge, certain activities that they do to add to the skills base that they need to have. And because of that, it allows students to build and apply and reflect on what they have learned. And the teacher monitors it because the students are working on it. They are writing it, they do something. So as an online facilitator, you need to be extremely active in an online space to ensure that you are able to see what your students are doing through their work, be it self-assessment, peer assessment, different types of assessment. And as we move along, we know that I'm going to start with looking at the differences between the two, traditional assessment and online assessment. And it's important for us to see the differences, because unless you understand the differences where we are, which many people were at just after COVID, that forced everybody to go online. And they usually assess after content. You deliver content and then you assess. And then all of a sudden, you are in an online space. You can't see when you deliver content like I'm doing now. I can't see you. I can't even detect whether you are following me or not. I'm just hopeful that something will happen. And then in an online space, this type of assessment should be integrated within the instructional material with activities. And you have to have a lot of activities, innovative activities that make students active. So students in this space become very active learners. So in traditional assessment, we have exams, rigid and fixed at a certain time. There are tests at a certain time. There are activities at a certain time. And with exams, especially, then they have to take exams at a certain time. And the other problem that we have recognized in traditional assessment, you find that exams, a lot of marks are heavy on exams. So you find that students who memorize the whole thing and able to regurgitate it, they are the ones who pass. Whereas students who have been going through the study material, maybe they get nervous or something like that, they don't pass or they don't get the good grades that the other one would get. So when you look at the two, the other one actually has learned far more than the one who have just given you back the material. And that's why maybe that's one of the major criticism of higher education, that we produce people who are unable to do the work when they get out into the industry. Because that's another thing. We need to know that we develop individuals for economic growth, for their own development, for the skills-based that they need to perform in the economy. So that's why assessment has to be integrated in your learning material, and students should see that happening. Curriculum drives assessment in traditional, so we start with teaching, and then we end up with assessment. Then when you look at this slide, I got this slide because one of the well-known assessment experts wrote this quotation saying, when the cook tastes the soup, that's formative assessment. And this, I think, explains what formative assessment is. As the cook tastes the soup, they put in some salt, butter, pepper to make sure that they build the soup to a desired state. But when the customer or the guest tastes the soup, that's summative assessment. That's the end product. So this person does not have an opportunity to go back and check if all the things, all the ingredients make sense. So there's a cook on the one side, and there's this family that is enjoying a meal on the other side. That family have no say. If the soup doesn't have salt, they can complain about it, but they cannot change the soup from its original, from the way the cook wanted the soup to taste like. The cook had an opportunity to go through the whole soup journey until it gets to a point where it's ready to be eaten. Now, there is assessment for learning, which is formative, and the assessment of learning, which is summative. So summative is of learning because it evaluates the end product. It looks at the end of the course and it evaluates that. And also it does validate the formative assessment. So there needs to be formative assessment before you can have a summative assessment. It allows students to demonstrate a range of skills, whereas in formative, it's carried out through the learning process. It's a weekly thing. It's a weekly MCQ. It's a weekly survey. It's a weekly poll. It's a weekly game, something that the students have to do weekly. It provides frequent feedback, which students need to improve performance, but also lecturers also need that feedback in order for them to improve their teaching, to improve the lesson. If they can see that the students are struggling on a certain concept, then they have to repackage it differently. So online allows that because you can remove stuff and you can add stuff so that you can even add a YouTube to make sure that students at least are able to understand the concept that you are trying to teach them. So it has high impact on current learning and help guide both instruction and teaching. So that is very, very important formative assessment for lecturers, especially those that are teaching in an online space or at a distance, because you don't have students to show you how you are doing. So you have to rely on all these things. And I have to say, it's not an easy thing to go through because you have to be very, very innovative so that students don't get bored in the process. You need to pace them so that they keep up with the course. The reason that there's a lot of dropout in online spaces and in distance is because students are used to having people telling them what to do. And when those people are not around, they don't know what to do. Well, I have mentioned that summative assessment and formative assessment. Summative assessment are exams, mostly are exams or project at the end. But project can start as a formative and ends as a summative, where as you look at the student work up until the project is all done and it's there, it's good. Where and portfolio, it can be a set of self-assessment, reflective journals, all the things that you wanted the student, all the skills and competencies are all combined together into a portfolio. You look at the knowledge base of the student, you look at the skills base of the student, you look at the competencies that are needed in that course for the student, and then they can end up being in a portfolio. Same to the research paper. You can build the research paper from identify a problem and then identify the objective. How are you going to address this problem? And where are you going to get information to address this problem? All that can be brought together formatively and end up being a summative in a research paper. Performance is one of those. Case studies, practicals, etc. They all start with formative. Collaborative assessment is one example where you expect all students to come together, work on a project, and then once they finish the project, it becomes a project that you can look at it using rubric to check if every student have actually participated in it. I think I'm going to stop here.
Yes. Very good.
And allow George to come up with something more technical.
Okay. Yes, I think what we're going to do is just take a quick pause. I think I forgot to mention that we're going to have some polling. So I think we're going to launch the first polling question right here. Before we invite George to speak. This is going to come up in your screen. There it is. Thank you, Kishin. I'll give everyone about a minute. What challenges do you face at your institution to implement digital assessment? please select the one that best reflects your experience. Look at this, here we go. It's coming in. I don't think you can see it, but I'll reveal, we'll hit the end polling button in about 30, 45 seconds. And I think that will also help drive some of the conversation or presentation from George and then subsequently Mpine. Okay, another 20 seconds. I'll stop in about, yeah, lots is coming in. Excellent. We have 202 people on and we have almost 150 respondents. You don't have to respond, but it will certainly make offer some food for thought as we progress. Another 5 seconds and I'll just click end so we won't be able to accept any more responses. I think we're just about there, 153, 154. Okay, let's see what we have. So what challenges do you face at your institution? Integrity, followed by reliability, resistance, and difference. But it's at the same time, it's rather an even distribution. So that speaks to, I think, a breadth of challenges that you are facing. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. We can share this after. I'm going to, again, go back to George, or excuse me, introduce George Veletsianos for the next segment. George?
Thank you so much, Kirk, and thank you, Mpine, for that introduction. I would like to talk about a very specific aspect of online assessments, but before I do, I would like to mention that I'm located in British Columbia, in particular in Victoria, and both the university and the neighborhood where I live are on the territories of Indigenous people. Specifically, these are the territories of the Lekwungen peoples, the Kwasapsum, and the Esquimalt nations. My work and my research focuses on online learning, and it focuses on trying to understand people's experiences with it. So how do we design for it? How do we make it better? How do we create powerful relationships? How do we create learning environments that value our students? Let's move on to the next slide, Kirk. So as you can imagine, when institutions transition to remote forms of teaching and learning in March, lots of relevant questions in my research became relevant in the broader context. So when institutions transitioned, many faculty found themselves teaching in uncertain and unfamiliar online environments. In these new spaces, faculty reached for familiar practices. They held real-time lectures, they assigned readings, and they sought different ways to help their students continue learning. One familiar approach that many tried to replicate online was that of supervised exams. And because getting together was impossible, remote proctoring became sort of the de facto technology to enable faculty and institutions to continue using exams, to continue traditional forms of high-stakes assessments. In other words, remote proctoring technologies were seen by many as a relatively easy way to continue doing business as usual. So at this point, you might ask, well, what does remote proctoring refer to, and what is the big deal about it? So remote proctoring refers to a family of technologies that create exam-taking conditions in remote environments. For instance, they might involve a technology that through a webcam, like this one, watches over a student while they take an exam to check for movements that might indicate cheating behaviors, such as, for example, getting up while taking an exam. This can happen through the use of algorithms or through having someone on the other end of the webcam watching a student. Other technologies work by locking down browsers and preventing students from navigating away. So the pandemic has led to increased emphasis on remote proctoring technologies in higher education settings. However, there's a serious risk here. The risk is that by relying on such solutions, by relying on remote proctoring, we might be creating more problems than we're solving. And there are two parts to this argument. The first part is that creating high-stakes assessments may not always be the best approach to assess student learning. Mpine talked about this a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit more about it later. The second part of this argument is that remote proctoring technologies rely on monitoring, on surveillance, on control. And in this way, they potentially create a culture of mistrust between ourselves as faculty and our students. We cannot ask students to develop trusting relationships with faculty and institutions, but then require them to use technologies whose job is to watch over them and control what it is that they're doing. The proctoring software industry says that such tools ensure academic integrity, deter academic dishonesty, verify test and assessment, but critics of these tools see them as unnecessary and inequitable. Students describe them as harmful. They raise privacy concerns. The tools appear to create anxiety among test takers. So there's a whole slew of problems that come with them. And this is also important because of what Martin Weller describes as software sedimentation. Software sedimentation is a process by which technologies become embedded in institutions of higher education. So as universities invest resources to use a technology like remote proctoring, these technologies become integral to operations. So they train people how to use them, they create processes on how to use them, they create policies, they pay to integrate them within the learning management systems and so on. So as the tools get embedded in our organizations, it not only becomes difficult to stop using them, but they become sort of de facto solutions to problems. So they become the solutions that faculty reach to when they think about assessment. So therefore, they encourage faculty to use high stakes assessment as exams. In other words, this becomes a cycle where exams encourage remote proctoring and the remote proctoring encourages exams, ending in the situation where high stakes assessment and traditional assessments are encouraged compared to other types of assessments that might be worthwhile for students to engage with. There's solutions to this, of course. Individual faculty members can avoid exams, they can avoid proctor exams. Students can petition their institutions to stop using such tools. They can ask for alternative assessments. Institutions can avoid proctoring, can avoid adopting some of these technologies. They can let some of these contracts end. There's better futures out there that don't involve proctored exams. Before talking about those alternatives to proctored exams, I'm going to pause and turn over to Kirk to see if there are any questions around this idea or if there's a poll that we can follow on through. But I'll return in a little bit to talk about alternatives and highlight some alternatives. And I think my colleague Mpine will also highlight some as well.
Thanks, George. I think we'll start with the next polling question, and I think we can then circle back to take a pause for some questions that I'll pose to you and Mpine.
That sounds great.
So participants, here's the next poll. Poll number 2. Thank you, Kishin. What do you favor as an alternative assessment to online proctoring? Clearly, we know where George's position lies, and it's certainly not on online proctoring, but you might have a different opinion. And there's one of the options. I still prefer online proctoring. Clearly, we're seeing people coming in with other opinions, portfolio formative assessments, demonstration of skills or knowledge, other. So I'll just give everyone about another 30 seconds. Let's see if we can get majority of people responding. We've just crested over 100. We have 202 online. This is really good. Another 10 seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and then I'll share my results right away this time so you can all see. So here we have just under 10% still say they prefer online proctoring. That is certainly fine. Some people have, I think, more success with that. Perhaps looking at portfolios of formative assessments, demonstration of skills or knowledge. I'd inserted other just because we thought we might have something we haven't thought of. 5 people said other, and we encourage you to perhaps pose those in the chat or the Q&A. What are your others in terms of alternative assessment? But to George and Mpine, we have clearly a preference of portfolios, those two that are more specific around formative assessments, again, from the portfolio point or perspective, or the demonstration of skills or knowledge. Anything that you'd like to speak to from your own experiences with either of these two, which really represent the clear majority of participants? George, maybe I'll go to you, and then I'll gesture to Mpine.
I guess the first point that I'd like to make is that it's heartening to see that people are using different kinds of assessments that aren't overwhelmingly relying on online proctoring. Portfolios have been sort of a staple in higher education for a while, and they receive a lot of sort of attention, but we often don't see them integrated as far and wide. So it's nice to see a high number on this here.
Mpine, do you have any response? I've got some follow-up questions, but do you have any response to these results? And you're muted, Mpine.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think I would respond to the portfolio, and I think many people see the value of a portfolio, but I know that for many of our colleagues, the portfolio seems to be a lot of work, because it's a combination of a whole lot of things. But I think if you do it properly, it may not be a lot of work. We'll be using rubric to ensure, and rubric also it's also helping students to learn and to see if they haven't done anything differently. And yes, I do understand people who still prefer the online proctoring, because all of us, we want to use the same pedagogical style that we have been using, and just putting it in an online space. Hence, we need exams. You know, we can't think beyond exams. How do you test people without exams? Portfolios are not good enough. Research papers are not good enough, because we are just taking what we are familiar with, which is teaching in a face-to-face, straight into an online space. And that's why, and proctoring companies are really selling it big. And maybe just one little example, if you may allow me, Kirk. In South Africa, where many of our students live in poverty-stricken environments, and one room is the only place where they can be. You can't have proctoring in that space, let alone other things. People are moving up and down, and this is their environment where they study. You cannot, it's not possible. Proctoring requires a whole lot more that you can say to people, keep quiet. And in places where, in urban areas where people are sitting next to each other, they are next to each other, the noise next door comes to your space. So that is not realistic in our context. I'll just leave it at that. We'll discuss it later.
Okay, I just want to touch base. I think that we don't want to say that, you know, I think there's, in some of the chat I've been following in the Q&A, that certainly there's a place, or certain bodies still advocate for online proctoring. Regulatory bodies like the engineering or nursing bodies require these kinds of proctoring exams. I'm not saying necessarily that's the ideal scenario, but those are still regulations that we have to deal with. I think one question I'll put back to you both is around the tensions between scalability and authenticity. Now, Mpine works in an institution that serves over 500,000 learners. UNISA is the biggest in the region of Southern Africa in terms of population student enrollment. So Mpine, and to George as well, but I'll first gesture to Mpine before we continue on with our next segment. Scalability versus authenticity, especially in a large institution like yours. How can that be, I don't know, how can that be reconciled in a way?
It's a challenge. It's a challenge to have many people who are scattered all over the country or even the continent who are supposed to be assessed. And then at the same time, we are looking at authenticity to make sure that what they are producing is actually coming from them. But again, it's a challenge. It's an instructional design challenge. When we design these activities that we expect students to have, and we have a rubric that helps them to go to, that guides them. What we're trying to do, I think, in education, our focus has always been on monitoring and policing the student to make sure that whatever that they do, they didn't copy from someone, and all the things that we do, and then we expect them to perform as a group after they get out of the environment, and yet we don't train them to work collaboratively in a school environment. We don't assess collaborative work. We expect certain things that when they leave the university structure, in any place, any industry, there are no exams. You don't get exempt. And yet in higher education, we are hell-bent over to do that. So again, I said initially that even with us at UNISA, because we have regulatory bodies that pushes us to have, at least you must have an exam, then we have all these people that have to come to a place, congregate in a place and take exams. Sometimes it's ridiculous, but it has to be done. But COVID, thanks to it, it has changed that completely. Now we are running to proctoring, we are running to all these other things that are not adding any value. I think we should start rethinking education and want to find and look at ourselves in terms of what is it that we want to achieve with this thing that we are trying to do.
Thank you, Mpine. George, I think this may speak to your next segment, if you can speak to that. Otherwise, I'm going to just, for the sake of time, I want to shift on to Mpine's back to Mpine for her segment to offer a case study around a different kind of assessment, formative assessment in a teacher education initiative that Mpine was leading. So Mpine, back to you, and I'll just forward to the next slide. We know who you are and your institution. This is what you'll be speaking to. Mpine, over to you.
I'm going to be very brief. During COVID-19, when it hit and there was a lockdown and all students were expected to go online, whether people were ready or not, whether teachers were ready, whether students were ready, everybody had to be in an online space and they had to teach. Now teachers did what they know how to. They took their courses and their classes exactly as they are to an online space. So you'll find a student or a kid, because now there are kids in a home where they sit in front of a computer or a laptop or a mobile phone the whole day when they're being taught. So a teacher will go through the class, the content according to the way they would do it in class. Now that's not how to teach in an online space. So a group of us came together from UNISA, my colleagues. We came together and we developed a program to assist in-service teachers, because in-service teachers do not have any support besides, well, they are not at universities. So at universities, probably they may have training programs for online teaching. But when you deal with in-service teachers, they're already in the field and no one is actually thinking about training them, especially during this time where everybody was confused about how to do these things. So as you are aware that I'm a co-chair in open education resources, I started looking for OERs that may be relevant to teaching online. And there are quite a few, but I picked two, one from the OERU and the other one from the Open University of the UK. The OERU one helped, it was about digital skills and digital literacy, where it helps people to understand the internet. Because as we started with teaching in an online space, because the other one was taking your teaching to a classroom, we realized that teachers themselves are not skilled in navigating their online space. So we started with the OERU one, the digital literacy one. And then those who passed can move into the next one of teaching, taking your teaching to a classroom. So those content were helpful because the OERs that we had badges, like what Kirk is alluding to, they have badges, they have certificates. So those who completed the course, they could do that. Now, as they were doing this, we realized that they are new in an online space and they don't know, even when they are navigating the space, it gets very confusing for them. So we provided support and we used the tools that they already have in their disposal. Many of them had WhatsApp. So we used the WhatsApp to build peer networks. So the way we used the WhatsApp, we divided them into groups, because then all of a sudden the numbers were becoming too big for the small number of facilitators who were trying to facilitate this course. So we got peer support groups who are supporting each other, because people don't learn the same way. So one person would learn faster than the other, and the one who learned the fastest in the group will help others. And it's only when the group cannot help each other that the facilitator will come in. So the facilitator will visit the WhatsApp periodically, and the facilitator had groups. So the facilitator was helping the groups, not individuals. Individuals were helping each other within the peer networks. So the facilitator support, they will send something every day to ensure that students are working in these groups. So a lot of them did work in the groups. A lot of them built peer networks, and a lot, and the peer networks, I think, were quite good. Then both facilitators and students, and in this program, because it was new, it was community-based, it was coming from the community, and it was responding at a speed. We were learning at the same time. So we kept on changing things as we were going along. So, and adding some things. Yes, we would call them once in a while for a workshop of this nature, just to go through certain things. And we also encouraged them to reflect. So the reflections that they gave were the ones that we're using to improve the course going forward. So, so that's in the nutshell, that's what we did, in the absence of content, in the absence of other things that were happening. So we decided to take this forward.
Thank you, Mpine. And I think that was really, what you described as it was a sort of constant formative assessment, if you will, in terms of checking in with learners and supporting them. So it was really kind of an ad hoc approach that you did. And it was very much necessitated by the fact that you had a small army of passionate educators that were helping the support of these WhatsApp groups. And now I think that has snowballed to, we're closing on about 600 learners, is that right? That have been benefited from this. All right, thank you, Mpine, for that example. I'm gonna shift to George, who's gonna share some more examples. And George, I think you're gonna share the website, is that right, from Australia?
Yeah, I'll share my screen in a few moments. Before I do that, though, I just want to touch on a couple points. You've heard me talk about alternatives to exams and remote proctoring. So, at this time, you might be wondering what options may be available to you. So if remote proctoring isn't a solution, what are some good ideas? What may be some good alternative assessments to try? And my first sort of advice centers around the idea that you have to think about your discipline. Assessments vary by discipline, of course, so you have to really think about what your own context means for choosing assessments. And there are cases where accrediting bodies require invigilated exams. So it's not as simple as saying, oh no, I'm not going to do this. Assessment is a personal faculty choice to some extent, but sometimes it isn't. And that's why creating a better future for online assessments requires many different actions, including advocacy, including policymaking, and changing policies. So my perspective is that in general, alternatives to high-stake exams should not only prioritize integrity, but should also prioritize trust over mistrust. Some of the typical assessments that I use are written reflections, presentations, debates, students taking over and leading class discussions, and so on. But what I want to do right now is to show you some examples of assessments that you might be able to explore also in your own time. I don't have a single solution that would work for everyone. I wish I did, but I think that by exploring different kinds of assessments, we can all begin to see how high-stakes exams are not the only option available to us. So what I want to show you is the University of Queensland's Assessment Ideas Factory. And if I may ask someone to place that link in the chat box. Let me share my screen right here. I believe you should be able to see that right now. So the University of Queensland, like many other institutions, has created a resource where its faculty and other faculty can explore assessments from colleagues. I like this site because it allows people to search by different options that might be relevant in their own course. So like, for instance, by class size, right? By attributes for the student, whether they want a written assessment and so on. So there's a number of them here. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'll just highlight 3 or 4 that I thought were interesting. The first one is a funding pitch. You might have heard of sort of this activity where students essentially get together in groups and make a pitch for either a product or a service to be funded. What's interesting about this is that you often hear it in sort of business schools, but this activity is described here in the context of a school of music. The second one is a portfolio. It's in the context of data analytics in a school of communication. We've talked a little bit about it, so about portfolios, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The next one that I wanted to highlight was a sound file project. In this project, students are asked to respond on a weekly basis to audio prompts and respond in audio. And what I really like about these assessments is that there's a section on this site for each assignment that talks about how this particular kind of activity supports academic integrity. So for instance, in this case, you'll see here that the author says, with weekly sound files, staff members become familiar with students' voices. So they reduce the possibility of others completing that assignment for them. So not only this site provides some examples, but it also provides rationale and explanation for why academic integrity is not necessarily just in the purview of invigilation, but these kinds of assessments sort of support it in different ways. And the final one, many of you might be familiar with, is the idea of reflective workbooks. And we do reflection a lot in schools of education. It is essentially a practice where we ask students to read a paper or read about a topic and then write the reflections about it in sort of an ongoing manner, in a consistent manner, which allows faculty members to then gain not just the understanding of what students know, but how they approach the topic, and they can see their development over time, thereby enabling them to assess development over time, personally, authentically, directly to particular students. So I'm going to stop there and stop sharing my screen, and I'll turn it over to Kirk.
Thanks, George. I think one question. So we're moving towards the next, well, the sort of the wrap up of the last 5 minutes. We'll go a little bit over time, and I hope people will stay on because I think the conversations are quite stimulating. There's a lot of chat and Q&A. One question I want to pose to both of you is around the really broad term of accessibility. So I've been trying to collate some of the questions that have been coming up both in the chat and the Q&A. And it's, accessibility comes in many shapes or forms. Some people have posted questions around people that have people with disabilities, people that have accessibility issues, hearing, seeing, perhaps other motor skill issues. That's one issue to think about with assessment. And also, the other one, and Mpine, we've experienced this, and this happens often in Southern Africa, is connectivity issues. Internet connectivity can be very uneven at times, power cuts, things like that. So in those kind of broad terms around accessibility, what reflections do you have if assessment were to be more of in a digital form, given some of these challenges and perhaps opportunities that digital assessment may pose? I'll gesture to Mpine first.
Okay. No, I'm sorry. Okay, I think there are a lot of challenges, especially in our context. There's the issue of connectivity, which is major. There's issue of accessibility in terms of it's economic accessible. It's not only connectivity; it's also being able to have the money to buy data and all those things that goes with it. But what we found is that even during the COVID, where people were forced to use certain things, including lack of those things that they were supposed to do, or lack of the material and all those things, it excluded a lot of people. And this is where the government and the political commitment should come in, because the job of teachers are not about infrastructure development and all and ensuring that people get access and all those things. Infrastructure is the work of the government. The government must make sure, government in developing countries must make sure that they invest in these things, because for many years they were allowed to do that, but they were not doing it because they were not forced to do it. But all of a sudden they had to start looking at ways of making sure that the students have access to this. The Minister of Education in South Africa had to go and talk to mobile companies that are getting a lot of money from people, because many people in this part of the world have mobile phones, and yet they are not contributing. There's no social contribution in terms of what they are doing. So I think when we look at accessibility, when we look at education, I think the starting point of looking at education, be it higher, lower, or any other form of education, is the social mandate, social justice mandate that has to involve accessibility. All people have to have access, irrespective of what they are doing and who they are. It has to be inclusive. And the curriculum as well has to be inclusive so that people can see themselves within the curriculum. It also has to be to enable participation in the debates. And you cannot have that in this technological era without technology. So technology is not a good to have these days. It's a must have. And another thing also is that we do have technologies that we have used the WhatsApp in the course. We used mobile phones because mobile phones are available to many people, and many people can have access to them. So it is important as well to look at other things. I think what COVID is teaching us is to start being creative and use whatever that we have. In other places, they use radio, they use television to be able to reach as many people as possible. So we need to be creative. It's not only a classroom that can provide education. We need to look at other things as well.
Yeah, and I think your WhatsApp example is a very good one. And I encourage participants to contact me at the end, and I can connect you with Professor Makoe to learn more about her work in that sort of authentic assessment or alternative assessment around using WhatsApp. George, over to you. Accessibility questions. I think Mpine touched on the equity side, but in the connectivity side, there's also that concept of contingency around assessment when the online might not work as well. Perhaps blending modes of assessment, some questions like that. Your thoughts?
I guess I just wanted to start by agreeing with Pina. I think access is the the issue that we're facing, equitable access in particular. And designing for that should encourage us to develop alternatives. I think the higher education system was built on the idea of a central place where students come, but I don't think that's the equitable approach. I think the equitable approach is to consider that we need to get to where students are, not the other way around, which is why online education sort of flips the idea around, right? It says, well, we don't need you to live your work, your family, your social connections, and travel to a faraway place to attend institution. We should figure out ways for us to get to you and prevent people from making those sacrifices to pursue education. Now, beyond that, I think, so beyond access, being the major issue that we need to deal with, which again, it's not just an individual faculty issue, it's a systemic issue. We need government support, we need administration, we need policies, we need all sorts of things to address that problem. It's a problem we should prioritize. I think at the individual level, we can use things like universal design for learning to consider how we can design educational materials and assessments that enable people to participate without necessarily requiring them to either have high-end devices or without requiring even digital access. So I'm thinking of things like open educational resources that reduce costs. I'm thinking of things like printed materials that are readily available before courses start. I'm thinking of things like even the sharing of connectivity at remote locations and so on. But again, some of these solutions are sort of regional and contextual, right? So solutions that might work in remote communities in BC might not necessarily work for remote communities in Lesotho, right? So I think there is great value in people not having these conversations and being informed by different contexts, but also figuring out solutions in their own contexts.
Yeah. Thank you, George. I think these are really good responses. I think we've given a lot of food for thought. I've just posted a message in the chat. We're going to have one more polling question, and then we're going to wrap up. So if you want to sit tight for another few minutes, let's look at this last polling question. What do you need to develop and deliver online assessment? Thank you, Kishin. Here it's been posted. Please indulge us just for a few more moments, and let's see what people have to say. What do you need to develop and deliver online assessment? Training, knowledge, time, experience, institutional support. No doubt all apply, but what is your main, need? And we're certainly seeing it trend towards training and knowledge. I'll release the polling. I'll just because of time, let's wrap it up. I'm going to wrap it up in 10 seconds. Okay, good. So we've got about 140 people. Here's the results. 70% training and knowledge is what they need. So I hope that you're getting some of that from today. And I think that'll also be a plug for the next 2 online workshops, which I'll be talking about just in a moment. Time, of course, is never enough. Experience, less so, and institutional support. Certainly, I think that notion, I think COVID, I'd be curious to see what that finding was pre-COVID. I would have thought it might be probably a bit higher. I think institutional support is certainly coming around. But yes, I think as Mpine said earlier, really have to rethink assessment. And I think that's been the premise of today's online workshop. We're we're just going to skip over discussion. I think we've already had some good discussion. I'm just going to move to summary. And as I just mentioned, as I mentioned at the beginning of today's session, summary will be, the summary recording will be made. This is the website. People have been asking about wanting the PowerPoint deck. You can send me or Kushin an email, and we'll gladly send you a link to the PowerPoint slides from today. There they are, kperris@cole.org or kfung@cole.org. Today as well, look in your inbox for a post-workshop short survey. We want to know what you think about today's survey, and give us some feedback. It'll help us to think about how we're going to deliver the next 2 online workshops. We're going to also ask you permissions to follow up contact with you for that recording release, and to offer more information on badging, which I'd mentioned at the beginning of today's online workshop. Moving forward, mark your calendars. As I said, February 18th is our next online workshop, same time. We'll be running on Zoom. Focuses on online course and assessment design to promote academic integrity. Integrity came up a lot in today's Q&A discussion and in the chat. James Skidmore of University of Waterloo and my colleague, Dr. David Porter of Commonwealth of Learning, will be running that session. March 4th, authentic and reliable student assessment experiences. Focus on coordination and design of authentic and reliable digital assessment. That point has also come up about reliability of the assessment. The participants there are Maggie Bukas-Amis from University of Namibia, Chantal Moore from University of the West Indies, and Tashani Haynes-Brown, also from the University of the West Indies. That will be chaired by my colleague, Marette Newman of Cole. Again, you can contact, I'll put our names right back up there, kperris@cole.org, kfing@cole.org. I'll ask Kishin to just maybe copy that and paste it into the chat as we wrap up in about 20 seconds time. So I just want to stop there and thank you so much. And really my thanks is first directed at Professor George Veletsianos and Professor Mpine Makoe, my colleagues that have devoted their time and their energy and intellect to expound on digital assessment. I thank also the participants that made time to come today. We had a captive audience. We've only lost 10 people. I think we peaked at about 202 and we're still at 190. So I think it speaks to the quality of the presentations from my colleagues, and I think the importance of the topic on digital assessment. So let's get that cart behind the horse and think about learner-centered design as the driver for digital assessment. I'll leave that with you. Thank you very much for your participation. And we look forward to seeing you in the subsequent online workshops in the coming weeks.